Hi, my name is Annie Vigil. I'm a second year law student at Penn State Law, and I'm participating in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. For one of the lab's projects, Witnesses to Her Story, we're capturing women's personal experiences in education, sports, and the workforce, focusing on the 1960s and 70s. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Kathlyn Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks has been a pioneer in psychology and body intelligence for over 40 years through consulting in the field of mind-body topics. She has also co-authored 12 books, including one of my personal favorites, Conscious Loving. Welcome, Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, so let's start off by talking about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
Well, that's interesting. I was actually born at Queen of the Angels Hospital in Los Angeles, and my father worked for General Motors. In fact, we were a GM family back in the time where that was how a lot of society, middle class society, operated. And but the downside was that we got moved a lot. So when I was 2, we moved to Kansas, and then we moved to Overland Park, Kansas, and then we moved to Indiana, and then we moved to Detroit, and then in 1960 we moved to Santa Barbara. And so that was when life really changed, because Santa Barbara and California were very, very different than the Midwest. So I have that, that mix of both, progressive Californian and solid Midwest. So it's made for a very interesting kind of inner psychology, but also a way of seeing the world.
And who lived in your house with you growing up?
I have my mother and father and 2 brothers, an older brother and a younger brother, and I was the only female in my whole generation, which was also a very interesting dynamic in our growing up. So, but I always got my own room because I was the girl, so that was the plus.
Yeah, can you tell me more about that dynamic? Were there any things about it that you didn't like being the only girl?
Well, there were people were always trying to groom me to carry their story forward. And so my grandmother, who was a concert pianist and supported her whole family, her father died when she was very young. And so she supported the family by teaching piano, and then she became a concert pianist. And she always wanted me to be a concert pianist. And she also really loved fashion and color. And my mother, in contrast, was very utilitarian and also a little bit crazy. And well, actually, she was a lot crazy, but that's a whole other story. But she always, from the time I was very little, I think one of the major dynamics is that she wanted me to be appreciated because she didn't feel appreciated in her growing up, and that was very much a stressor for her. But she also wanted me to really conform to 50s and 60s ideas about how females should be. And of course, that was the things you said about me most when I was little, was that I was incredibly stubborn. And how I received that was actually as a compliment, because it meant that I was really standing up for myself and what I wanted, rather than just being, the daughter. And her other obsession was making sure I didn't get fat. Because for some reason, that was very important to her. And I think she had that associated with whether I would be accepted and loved. And because I think she associated her sort of being chubby in different parts of her life, that she really took that in as making her more deficient. And she didn't want me to be that way. But what it ended up being was that she always tried to control what I did, what I chose, what I wore, and particularly what I ate. Like, you're not going to eat all that, are you? Which was, I know Elvis said that in a different way. He'd say, you're not going to eat all that, are you? And he would reach over. That's what my brothers did. My brothers would eat off of my plate. So there were some interesting dynamics going on. But I think that basically she was in that generation. uh, she got married right at the end of the war, the Second World War, and she had a certain amount of freedom. But then after the war, there was this whole attempt to stuff women back into the kitchen. And she was a very accomplished artist, but she never really committed to that. And it was in that, well, which is still somewhat of a dynamic of, you can be a homemaker, and take care of children, or you can have a career, but you can't do both. And so she always was dissatisfied with both of them. And so she would be, I think if she had had her choice in it, that she probably wouldn't have had children. And so I was always aware that, that she reluctantly took care of us, and really loved her art, but she couldn't really commit to it because there was always something that needed to be, taken care of in a home with. And she, because my dad worked for GM, her basic role was that of hostess. And, she would, she was famous for her parties. And, she knew how to do all of that. And she would pass that on to me about how to entertain and, all of the different things that you need to, like, to support the man. And so that whole dynamic was very, I think it gave her, some satisfaction, but not a deep creative satisfaction. And the problem was she took that out on all of us for her, and especially me, because then she passed on the story like I was to, represent the women, but also she wanted to make sure that I had something to fall back on in case I didn't get married. So, so when I took my typing course, she was just so excited about that, and as it turned out, I really was too, because typing, this was way before computers, but that was one of the major skills that made a difference in my life, of being able to write my dissertation, and which was on typewriters back then, because there were no computers yet when I got my dissertation in I got my doctorate in 1982. So what I got to observe, though, was the changing of dynamics in society up close, in my own family, but also because I was in school, at the time where all of these upheavals were going on, came of age at that time. So it was a very dynamic time to be in society. We all felt like we literally could change the world.
And how did you manage those expectations that your mother or the other women, your grandmother and your family were putting on you?
Well, one of the main dynamics was reading. Because I had my own room and reading was considered, intellectually stimulating, I could always go to my room and read. And that's how I got my, a sense of privacy and away from everybody's expectations. I read voraciously. And, I started reading when I was 3, and I just read everything that you put something in front of me and I'd be reading it. So I read cereal boxes, but then when I started, going to the library, which to me was heaven. When we moved to Santa Barbara has one of the most beautiful libraries that I've ever been in. And so I became so fond of not only the nourishment of reading, but the way I could tour the world and I could learn about things, rather than just looking at what was going on in my family or in my community. I was always curious about how things work. Not only how does society work, but how do humans work? How does this actually work? And so how I managed it was becoming a very keen observer. And I think that's where some of my psychology skills came into play, because I looked at what people were doing, not what they were saying. And that started from the time I was very, very little, that I could tell that there was something emotional going on, and that it was either safe or not safe to be around my mother. And so when she would go off, she would get she had a psychotic break when she was in college that I didn't find out about actually until I was in my late 20s and already practicing as a therapist. But there you go. You know,
Wow.
trying to figure out, and there was also this big something was going on in my family, and I knew that something had happened that kind of changed everything in the dynamics of our family. And I didn't find out about that, and for sure until I was 40. But as it turns out, my younger brother is my half brother. And his birth when I was 4 changed our whole family because I knew, I've always been very intuitive, and I knew, and my mother knew that I knew. And so she separated from me, and my dad was the only other person who knew about this, and he separated from me. And so when I was about 4, I experienced that my sense of family uh, really changed. And so from that time, I was always looking for like the journey, like I read all of the mythologies of the world by the time I was 14, and like, what's the meaning of life and what's the purpose and how can we take the hero's journey? Because I always felt like there were not enough journeys about women. So I was looking for those. But up until the internet, it was much more difficult to find them. So how I cope with that was by getting very curious, and also learning how to defend myself against my brothers who were, uh, they were, they ended up both being engineers. My dad is an engineer. So it was like the engineering part of the family, and then my crazy artist mother, and then me. And so I really, I think very early decided that I was going to forge my own path. And the feedback that I got about that from my mother, which was both affirming and kind of hilarious, was, um, well, you certainly seem to have your own style, and you certainly seem to know what you want, and you never really let people tell you what to do. And in fact, that is still true. One of the reasons I became an entrepreneur is I don't like people telling me what to do. So, but I just use that trait in myself to support evolution rather than to become a problem or a delinquent.
Wow. Did you ever see your parents pushing your brothers into like different avenues than you?
No, no. This was the time where I discovered I had this one interaction after I had met my husband Gay, and we had been together a few years, and we had gone back to, we lived in Colorado at that time. We had gone to visit my folks who lived in Santa Barbara in this beautiful house up on top of the, could see all around. It was really, very lovely. And we had gone to stay with them for a weekend, and I was back in our bedroom, I think, getting dressed, and my brother came out, and he saw somehow my older brother was there visiting, and he lived in Texas, and so he was visiting there. My mom and dad and my brother Bill were talking in the kitchen, in the little kitchen nook, and Gay, my husband, came by and he saw them, and he recognized that there was this kind of, this is the family. They were spontaneous and funny and carrying on. And he was, I think, in some other part of the kitchen. And then I came into the kitchen and everything changed. And the conversation changed. And I would not ever have known this except intuitively, except Gay said, the whole conversation shut down when you came in the room. And it was this confirmation of, oh, yeah, I'm, I'm in fact, my brother Bill was always called number one. And my mother would say, I'm just talk to number one. And so I developed a persona that I called an Avis persona. I'm number two, I try harder. So to be able to get some attention and some feedback, I was the super responsible one and I took care of things. But my brothers could be out in the backyard, making firecrackers and chasing each other around. But when something needed to be done, my mother would say, would someone please? And the someone was pretty much always me. Would someone set the table, or would some, and I was aware of this dynamic, but I was also a kid. So, I couldn't really do anything about it, but I noted it very carefully, and what that was about. And it was very interesting that when I met Gay, one of the first dynamics to really unwind was how I carried over my number two persona in interacting with him. And that was part of what we wrote about, both in Conscious Loving, but also in our other, in our persona work, and the how a close relationship is really a place where you can unwind those learned patterns and become more authentic, and evolving with each other, rather than recycling old patterns. So we've used everything that's happened in our lives as grist for the mill.
And as a child, without the perspective of later in life, how did you feel having one of your siblings referred to as number one over you? How did that make you feel?
Well, there was basically confused. I always felt like, why, and all of the different dynamics about girls and boys. I thought, well, why is this? How come how come I don't get called on in class? I'm just as smart as these guys. How come? So I started noticing gender differences really, really early. And what I started doing, there was just this, I remember in the fourth grade, my teacher was bullying one of the other students, was verbally bullying a boy. And something, I was like 9 years old, and something stood me up out of my chair, and I said, you can't talk to him that way. And then I sat down again, and he stopped. And it was my first kind of daring to speak up, and to stand for equality, and for people being treated with respect and dignity. And I continued to do that. And so I turned my own personal experience. Well, partly, I mean, I felt sad,
Yeah.
and I also felt angry, but it was not, well, there wasn't really any place to aim my anger, because it was just the way things were. But then when we entered the 60s, and we got into the late 60s, and a whole bunch of people said, wait a minute, why are we doing things this way? And we're going to do things differently. I was all ready for that. But as a child, I think I took refuge in my own imagination, and my own inquiry into, all right, where did this come from? So I studied history. That's why I went into looking in mythology, like, well, okay, where did all of these lines of power, where did they begin? How did that happen? And that's really continued lifelong. I've been a lifelong reader, and now that we have the internet, oh my God, it's just so. I say, well, when did that happen? I'll just Google it, and then I'll follow it, and I can spend hours doing that, of just following the thread of how stories became real and had power, and how we might change that.
And I want to talk a little more about how you felt in your early education, K through 12, with those gender differences. Did your school have a dress code, or was there anything you were required to wear?
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. Yes. And not only that, but I was of the era where the girls went to cotillion. Well, I mean, the boys did too, but it was really aimed at the girls, like what you're supposed to wear, and the gloves, and how you're supposed to behave. And there was a bunch of that, of how you conduct yourself, how you hold yourself. And it was basically the girls' responsibility. So interactions, if boys were badly behaved, it's because they like you, all of that early, like if someone would pull your bra strap, it's because he likes you. So the the boys could get away with it, and all the responsibility was all of the girls. And the gender differences were not as, I don't think, as striking for me because I was pretty smart. So I could, I did really well in school. I graduated salutatorian from high school because I had one B, and and my friend had all A's, and so she was the valedictorian. So once again, I was number two. So I repeated that pattern. I mean, it's really striking when I look back at it. I repeated that for quite a long time because there was this sense of, I knew really early on that if I stuck my head out there, it was dangerous. I mean, I could feel, in my whole being that women were both, females were both admired and feared. And there was so much ignorance about gender, and there was no education about sexuality, pretty much at all. And so there was this fear attached to, I remember here's my sex education story. When I was of 12, my mother came in and sat on the edge of my bed. When she came in the door, she had this look on her face that I thought, uh-oh, I've done something really bad. And so I went on alert. And so she sat down on the edge of the bed and she said, Kathy, don't ever let a boy lie on top of you. And then she left. And that was and so you can imagine what I made up about. I was totally confusing. So what I took from that, because we had basically no books. There was really nothing about accurate sex education, even how bodies worked. Our bodies ourselves didn't come out until the 60s. And so I was born in 48. And so all through the 50s and the early 60s, particularly when I was, before I even was a teenager, there was a sense of, you're really valuable, but you're also, your being in your body is shameful. It's wonderful and it's shameful. So there were so many confusing dialogues and stories, but there was also a sense of, it's up to you. You're the morality police, and you should not let a boy, like, there was no responsibility given to boys at all. And that's still pretty much a very common thread of, like, she asked for it, and how is she dressed, and you should never go out alone after. So this sense of both treating ourselves as precious, but also as throwaway. And so those dichotomies were just incredibly confusing. So I spent a lot of my childhood being really afraid. I just, because there was so much that wasn't being explained, and so much going on behind the scenes. And then, she got into trouble. And, so like she got into trouble. So, and that just infuriated me. When I really understood that it takes two people to make a baby, but only one of them, gets dragged through the mud and, has all of these consequences. So I think that it made me more withdrawn than I otherwise would have been, because it's only been in my adult life that I've realized that I'm actually really sociable. And, I love to get close to people and I love to explore with people. But as a kid, that just felt too dangerous.
Yeah, were you able to talk with any of your friends about these subjects? How did you, who
Well,
did you
see, the
meet?
problem was we moved a lot. So, I had what saved my childhood was this wonderful girl named Linda Roberts. And when I lived in Indiana for 5 years, and she was my best friend. And we would spend her house or my house, and we did psychic experiments with each other. And she would say, I'm thinking of, and I would try to guess, or we had all of these different kinds of games that we would create with each other. Plus we'd go bicycling and go to the movies and go swimming. And so I had the experience of a close female friend. And that was really because we moved so much. I never really had that again, but I really experienced that gave me the sense of that women could be advocates for each other, that not just in competition, because there was also this, you got to get your man. Even as even as a kid, I would hear my mother and my aunt talking about, well, I already got my man, so I'm not really concerned about if I gain a little weight, because of course, if you let yourself go, you couldn't get the man. So there were all of these stories woven around that my job was to get a man. And and then other than that, it would be nobody really cared about what I wanted to contribute in the world or do in the world.
And were you interested in getting the man? Like, was that something that you ever felt like you were supposed to do because everyone was sharing that?
Well, wasn't what I was most interested in. There was another seminal event that happened when I was in fourth grade. I was a terrible student up until the fourth grade, and there was a picture that was on Facebook a little while back, was of a kid who looked just like me with the short haircut, sort of like, cut across here and then very short here. And she's sitting in her desk like, she squirming. I was a squirmer. And my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Morgan, said, you can sit in the back of the room and you can move as much as you want to. And so I did that. And I literally went overnight from being a C student to an A student because I could move. And being a kinesthetic learner, she recognized that in me. And it really, I think it really saved my life, that I began then to find, because when I'm moving, I can think. See, when we kinesthetic learners, if we don't move, we get stupid. And so and so being able to move. And so now whenever I get stuck or anybody else gets stuck, I've brought movement to the world of psychology. And that's been my great passion, over the last 50 years. In fact, I'm a registered dance movement therapist. It was a whole other great story about how I became a dance movement therapist, because I basically have I created my college degree. I created my career. I have been an entrepreneur since 1976. I've not worked for anybody since 1976. So I've made my living as an entrepreneur. And so deciding like, I don't like this. I'm going to create something new. I started doing that very early.
That's amazing. I'm so excited to get to talking about your career really quick. I
Sure.
just want to touch on one thing. We talked a little bit about your sexual education. What
Yeah.
about education pertaining to menstruation? Was that offered in schools?
Oh my God. I was just watching I've just started to watch Periodical. I don't know if you know, MSNBC has this new, and what was stunning about that you would never know that menstruation existed. I mean, literally, it was never mentioned. Nobody ever talked about it. You couldn't mention it on television. You couldn't mention anything about, menstrual. In fact, there were no menstrual products for a long time. That when, gosh, I think it was maybe in the 60s that they started, I forget exactly when Tampax got invented, but, pads and so forth. But I think we had 1 hour in one class when I was in the fifth grade that was very, very basic. It didn't talk really very much about sexuality at all, but it was very basic about, periods and what happens, and, that happens every 30 days or so. And, but that was about it.
And did they separate you, the girls and the boys, for that
Oh,
time?
yeah, of course, absolutely. And it was also kind of this secret, slightly shameful thing. And there was this overlay of shame that I experienced, and I know that all of the girls, that I was associated with, like, there's this something that happens to you, but it's so bad that we can't talk about it. Nobody can know about it. You have to hide it. You have to make sure that you present yourself as if nothing else nothing's going on. You never mention it. You would never hear it. Anybody talking about having a period, that didn't on television. That didn't happen until way later, that there's 50% of the population is going through this thing, every month, and it's invisible. And when things are invisible, people make up all kinds of stories about them. So one of the stories that I got is that there's something really bad about me, but I don't really know what it is. But it's something that boys don't have to deal with. And so it allows them to make everything that happens sexually my fault or a girl's fault. Like, you let him on, you let him get away with it. So the whole inequality of responsibility was the big thing that I took away from my sex education. Was like, it's up to you, babe.
Yeah, who was applying all of that blame and shame to you? Who was telling you that it was so bad?
Well, it wasn't so much what they were saying to me, it was what they were saying to each other and what was happening in the culture. Like in the movies, it would always be about it was always her fault. Like, she shouldn't have gone out with him. Or it was, oh, boys will be boys. They, I'm sure that, I'm sure she led him on, and so he couldn't help himself. So the whole idea of actually taking responsibility for your choices and your actions was just not mentioned. So if you look at any of the films from that era, when there's sex involved, it's dangerous, and it's going to be your fault. If you get pregnant, it's your fault. And the shame that was attached to that also. If somebody got pregnant, she got taken away. She had to, there was never any, okay, who's the guy and what are you going to do about it? How are you going to take responsibility? So to add into all of that, I got pregnant the first time I had sex.
Oh,
And
wow.
I got pregnant at 19.
Hmm.
I had my son when I was just 20 years old, just barely 20, and I got divorced at 21. So that was all part of my later, if you want to get to that part. But
Yes.
so that, and, I went back to school when he was 4 months old.
Mhm.
And because I thought, if I don't continue my education, I might as well just kill myself.
How did the other people in your family react? Were they supportive of you?
Well, they were, I would say, mildly supportive, but it was more, they were ashamed of me. Like, okay, we'll support you, and you should get married. And so I did. And my mother actually said, why don't you get an abortion? And although I'm totally pro-choice, I just I just couldn't do it. So I went ahead and had this giant baby. He weighed 10 and a half pounds. So that was a whole other thing. But I was by then I was a single parent. And so I put myself through school I was a sophomore in college when he was born. And so I put myself through school, but I also created my own degree.
That's so amazing. How did your partner react to when you found out you were pregnant?
I think he was honorable. He said, well, let's get married and we'll get, and he was also then going to go back to school, but decided not to, and worked in the oil industry. And so for about a year, I tried to be a good housewife, and do all of the, homemaking and all that. That lasted for a year. And I just said, oh, I can't do this. And so and as it turned out, he had his alcoholism in his family, which, I of course didn't know when I first saw him. He didn't appear to have any problems, but with all of the the drugs and sex and rock and roll of that time. He ended up being going into alcoholism. So it was a good choice for me to just to go out on my own, and that's what I did. And it was very gosh, it was very difficult, um, because I didn't get much financial support from anybody. But it was at the time where free universities, so this was in the late 60s and early 70s. And so in California, UCSB, where I was able to go, I was able to stay in married student housing because I had a kid. And it turned out that the only other single parent lived right across the hall from me and had a daughter who was 2 months older than my son. And so they played together. We shared babysitting. The school had a free clinic. They had a nursery where I could take him when I was going to my classes, and then I could contribute time every week instead of money. And so I was able to make it work. And it was also in the middle of all of the upheaval about not only the inequality for women and men, but also the civil rights movement. All of those things were passed in that in that decade when I was coming of age, and in the 60s, and then in the early 70s. And there were demonstrations on the college campuses. And I remember leaving my son with my mother because I told her I was going to a demonstration and I wanted to leave him with her. And when I came back, she said, "Oh, I thought you were going to something like a demonstration of cooking or a demonstration of, that I was going to be learning something." I said, so it was an education for my parents also. But they had learned by then to not try to tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. Because they really could see that I was going to be forging my own path. And so they basically did their best. Well, they just continued to be very mystified by me. Whereas my older brother was he sounded like my dad. He acted like my dad. He was just a very earnest, sincere, lovely guy who did his job, took care of his family, and had a much more conventional life than me.
And so if university housing wouldn't have had that space for you, do you know where you would have lived as a single mother with a child in that time?
Oh yeah, I think it would have been actually pretty easy because Isla Vista was one of the hotbeds of political unrest in the country at that time. And I'm sure I would have been able to just put a notice in the university newspaper, a single parent needs room in a collective. There were lots of collectives, lots of people experimenting with different ways of living. And so I'm pretty confident that I would have been able to do that.
When you speak about creating your own major and your own degree, how did you go about doing that?
Well, when I graduated high school and with a real passion for both dance and English. So I was an English major in college, but also with a dance minor. But I was such a troublemaker in my dance classes. I would say, "Gosh, isn't there another? Can't we just move the way we feel? Why do we have to make all these strange shapes and architectural things that really has nothing to do with our aliveness?" And so they said, "There's a woman doing a class that I think you're going to like." And I arranged to go and visit this. It was a traditional dance class studio with a bar and the mirrors and an open floor. And when I went in and I took my seat, she knew that I was going to be there observing the class. I saw a group of middle-aged women moving across the floor, and what they were moving was no. They were each of them dancing their own no, no, no. And that was it. I looked at that and I said, "I don't know what this is, but this is what I want to do." And turned out that this was a dance movement therapist, Joan Smallwood, who lived in Santa Barbara at that time, this Joan Chodorow now. And I said, I'm going to do this. And then she had people sit in a circle, and after they had moved, and where they were talking about their experience, and she said, well, when a patient was having difficulty with some inner process, Jung would always have them turn it into some kind of creative expression. And so the connection between movement and your inner life, when I heard that and registered that, I said, this is what I want to do. And I had just started reading work by Mary Whitehouse, who was one of the dance therapy founders, back in the 40s and 50s. And I was able to meet her later in life and work with her for 3 years before she died. So I said, okay, now what do I need to do to become a dance movement therapist? There were no graduate schools at that time. So I actually created an independent major. I knew, well, I'm going to need psychology. I'm going to need physiology and exercise physiology. I'm going to need some sociology. I'm going to need, and so I took elements from different professions and also from different points of view, and I put together a proposal for an independent major, which was accepted. And so I graduated. My degree took me 4 months to make up this title. My degree, which I graduated with honors, by the way, which I'm very proud of, being a single mother. My degree is in kinetic emotional communication.
Wow.
My BA.
Mm-hmm. How did
and then this woman started inviting, I said, well, I want to do more and find out more about dance therapy. And she was working at a clinic in Santa Barbara. And so I gathered up my dollars. And so I did 3 sessions with her where she did a dance therapy session with me as the client. And then I wrote my senior thesis on dance therapy from different points of view. So from a Gestalt point of view, from an Adlerian point of view, that was what I presented for my graduation. But her boss, the psychiatrist, read my thesis and started inviting me to their not only their day treatment, but to their patient reviews, where the sociologist and they had their staff would meet, and Joan was a part of this. And so I started going to those. And as it turned out, and then I started going through, and pretty soon they realized I was doing an apprenticeship, because everybody had dance therapy. All of the patients who came to this clinic had dance therapy. And as it turned out, this institute, Santa Barbara Psychiatric Medical Group, was a unique production. The patients, which you almost can't even do today, and this was back in the late 60s and early 70s, the patients could come to staff meetings and hear about themselves. The patients could look at their files. The patients ran their own halfway house. So, they'd have supervision, but they made their decisions. And we were just a couple of blocks from Cottage Hospital. So if a patient needed to be hospitalized, we would people them rather than medicate them. In other words, they would have somebody with them around the clock so that they wouldn't have to be, medicated into, submission. And so that's where I started, and I was about, I think I was 21 or 22 at the time, but I looked like I was 13, and so here's me working with, doing sessions with middle-aged women, and, who had, I worked with people who were bipolar and, had, really significant and psychiatric diagnoses. And so I just jumped right into the deep end, and that's how it all started.
Wow. How did the people around you react to you creating this whole degree and profession from your passion?
Well, I didn't, let's see, did I even have any friends back then? I was so, I was working and taking care of my kid and, and finishing my degree. I had a few people that I knew, but I was still pretty shy at that time and, wouldn't naturally reach out. I did know some people, but I think also many people were kind of intimidated by me because I was so different, and, I didn't do the conventional things. I was the only person in my whole graduating class that had never gone to a football game because I thought that football was just was about class warfare and it was basically stupid. And so, and then there was one of my professors, Garrett Hardin, who was the man who wrote The Tragedy of the Commons, which is the seminal climate. This was back in probably 1969 or when that came out. The Tragedy of the Commons is really about, well, my one sheep, on the commons is not going to make a difference. And then people, and by the time people realized that each one of those choices was adding to the overload, it was too late. And so the sense of not being able to distinguish individual choices and their impact on the whole started for me way back then. And but I think that there was so much going on. We had the Vietnam War, we had which was and there was a draft then. So people were directly affected by it. It wasn't like, oh, those 1% that are going off to war. It was like, is your neighbor going to be going next? So there was so much for people to pay attention to that I just think they thought I was kind of strange.
Interesting. And then, so I've heard a little bit about how you and your husband Gay met. I would love to hear the story from your perspective about meeting.
Sure. Well, as it turns out, my graduate school, my PhD is from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And when I was invited to come and teach movement therapy there. And when I walked in the door, there was a little poem that was on the bulletin board. The graduate school was actually in the basement of a place called Vallombrosa, which is a retreat center in Menlo Park in California. And so you go downstairs and the big meeting room, when people would walk by, you could see their lower half, which was also very amusing through the windows. So there was a poem on the bulletin board and it said, "There are fools who dance and fools who watch the dance. If I must be a fool, I'd rather be a dancing fool." And I said, this is my place. Because I wanted to get, I'd gotten my degree. I'd been practicing as dance movement therapist for about 9 years by then. But I wanted to get an advanced degree because, I wanted to be able to use myself more fully. And so I decided to go to graduate school there. So I was both a student and a professor at my graduate school. So when Gay came, we were in a circle in this dojo that I was telling you about that where there were mats on the floor. We met around and so we had lots of place to experiment. And so there were about 50 people in the room. And I saw Gay looking around the room and looking at people. And I could see that he was looking at people's energy. And I knew how to do that, but I hadn't really seen other people doing that. So I was really interested in what he was doing and how he was doing that. And then he came past me, about 2 people, and then he came back. And we looked at each other and had this recognition that it took us about 6 months to unpack everything that happened in that. But one level was he could see that I could see that he could see. So that was and then there was this deep sort of portal opening where we saw each other. And then he went around the rest of the circle and he started talking. And I thought, this is the most brilliant, funniest man that I've ever heard. And I was so enthralled. I still have the notebook where I was taking my longhand notes about what he was talking about energy, and about how energy and consciousness and how it shows up in the body, which was very different than how, from the Renaissance on, it really been heady, thinking, and that's really what's important rather than the life of the body. And so then at the break, I went up to ask him a question, and I didn't even get the question out of my mouth because the first thing he said was, "I'm very attracted to you." And then he said, I'd love to ask you out for coffee, but I want to let you know that I'm only interested in relationships that are really based on both people being honest and authentic, and both people knowing how to take responsibility for what's happening, and both people being committed to their creativity. It was longer than that, but that's the gist of it. And he said, so, on the basis of that, would you like to go out for coffee? And so here's what I heard. I heard, I don't care what you're doing, what's going on in your life. I want you to drop everything and come out to Colorado with me for this adventure. And so it took me about 15 seconds to assess that. And I said, how about lunch? That was I upped the ante. And, and it wasn't very long after that. I mean, we really did have an instant and a permanent recognition. There was a lot of stuff to handle. There was a lot of drama to handle, but that's where that all started in 1980.
And why did you think, or why did you hear when he said all of that, that it was him wanting you to drop everything for him?
It wasn't for him. It was for the adventure.
Okay.
Yeah, it was very clear. It wasn't for him. It was for this adventure of consciousness. Well, it's because I'm very intuitive.
Okay.
So I knew that that's what he, and it turns out that it was in fact what he was.
Yeah.
So that just let him know that I knew what was going on, even though he didn't say it.
Okay. And then when you guys were dating and then decided to get married, how did you decide where you would live?
Well, after Gay was a professor at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. And so I made, he wrote the book, The Big Leap. And I realized a little while ago, hey, I made a really big leap. I left everything in California, my work, my clients, my friends, my community, and moved to Colorado because that's where he was at the time. And so I decided it was more important for me to go to where there was a base where we could explore rather than both of us leave where, and it wouldn't make any sense for him to stay in California because he already had a really, pretty good job.
Okay. And then given that you had all of this work and all of these clients and everything already formed in your name, did you and your husband ever have a conversation about whether you wanted to change your name?
Oh, yes, but I'd already changed my name several times, so it didn't really make any difference to me.
Okay. How did you and your husband start writing together? What was that process?
Oh, okay. Well, we spent most of the first couple of years talking a lot, and like lying around and talking about sort of the nature of how things work, the nature of consciousness and energy and all of these different dynamics, and moving. And I pretty much right away started working there. And because he was a university professor, he had access to all kinds of support, for writing. And he'd already published, I think, 2 or 3 books. So he already had he already had the opportunity for writing more books. And so we started writing the things that we were exploring. And my major contribution to all of the books are the processes. So part of my genius is taking a concept like commitment and turning it into an experiential process where people can actually have a direct experience of what commitment is and how to use it and how to apply it in life. And it's also a very fun way to learn. So I have probably, I have dozens of processes that I created. So all of our books have processes in them. And I would also, Gay did, there's some of the books where I've done more of the writing. Most of our co-authored works, I'd say it's about 60-40. I'd say that Gay is an incredible visionary. And so, and what I do is bring those visions into actionable, here's how you behave differently, here's how it might affect you differently, here's a process that you can do that will really allow you to change your relationship or your nature of your work or make decisions in your career, and but not from just talking about it, from moving with it. And so our also our website, particularly our foundation for conscious living.org, is full of processes. Those are all processes I've invented, over the years. And so the process of writing, he would also ask me, like, do you have, because I was also working with clients at the time. He'd say, I'm really working on this thing with anger. And do you have any clients who are, giving examples? So many of the examples in the books are from my clients. And, I would write up what had happened. And so it was, sometimes we would write together, but most often, I'd have something I was working on and he'd have something that he was working on, and then we would put it together. And our book, this one, Conscious Loving Ever After, is the one. I have two books I consider mine. One of them is The Conscious Heart, which I'm the senior author on that one. And I wrote the majority of that book. And Conscious Loving Ever After, which is our latest relationship book, I not only did most of the writing, but I edited this one.
Wow.
So I took charge. I said, because he'd done, the majority of handling the editing, which is not the fun part of writing. When you get, have to, this belongs over here, and you didn't do a wind up to this, and you just dropped this one. So that one really takes months, and it's really where the nitty gritty of a book comes into form. And so I think that Gay had just had he had his knee replaced. And so I said, I'll do the editing on this one. And so I did. And so my sense is that over the years, what I discovered is that my passion and my genius is also in interacting with people. And my facilitation, it's both just a total source of joy, but I think it's the most powerful thing I do. When I'm working with people, I can help evoke, what it is that wants to be expressed, and what, very, very easily. And I can teach other people how to do that. So I've become the main facilitator of our work. And Gay he's also branched out into writing fiction. And some of he has. So the last 10 years has really been really much more of this kind of switching roles. And I think that in a rich relationship, you just keep growing and discovering, and and what's been really wonderful now this whole year since March. I don't know if Gay broke his leg really badly in March, and then he broke it again at freak accident, same leg. So he's been basically rehabbing since March. So I've been caregiving, and as well as, doing all of the different things around the house. So we're just now getting more bandwidth and, like more, I have more, like I can do these kinds of things. And that's really been fun. But I think our writing together stemmed out of our mutual passion for evolution, and creating a template for particularly the power of authenticity, the power of genuine being able to respond. So not responsibility as a blame or burden, but genuine, I'm able to respond to life fully. and then also appreciation. Those three principles weave their way through all of our work and continue to emerge in the different processes and the different interactions that we have, and they've held steady over the years. Plus, this whole one of the things that I've been branching out. So I created these things. This is a deck of integrity cards from our study of what is it to actually live in integrity that we've been studying for several decades, and how to make it interesting and exploratory for people rather than just a list of things on a page. And so I created these with collages with an artist, and so you look at one side to get an idea, from what the artist created these collages, and then on the other side it's got a statement and a question that allows you to integrate a principle of integrity. So the creativity continues.
Yes. One of the things that I really wanted to ask about the books is
Yeah.
conscious living. You guys talk a lot about having equitable relationships. And I think that is so progressive, even sometimes for people's view of relationships today. I was
Yeah.
wondering if you ever received any shock or pushback from people about those ideas.
That's a big yes. Especially the thing we get the most pushback about is telling the truth.
Mhm.
And now the truth has been so corrupted, by the last 8 years, that I actually don't use that anymore. I talk about speaking unarguably, speaking in a way that the other person can hear you. And now I call it speaking from discovery, that when I'm actually speaking from what's emerging, not only does that create connection, but it also creates the possibility of some new creation rather than repeating an old pattern of us versus them. I'm more powerful than you. And but boy, oh, we've gotten pushback on all of our stuff. Now, remember, we started talking about these things in the 80s. It was like we had come from Mars. And so a lot of the things that we created, decades ago are now being, like somatic. I mean, we started that, a whole somatic thing. We started that. The whole, we helped people now ecstatic dance, where you can, and the different ways that people are using dance. We started that in our retreats. Whenever we'd have a retreat, we'd take everybody out to wherever there was music, and everybody would be dancing and sharing with each other. So, my sense is that the main pushback comes from people being afraid. And my latest work that I'm most passionate about is how to how to befriend fear. Because when I look around, I see that fear is at the basis of all of the problems that we're dealing with. And if we were able to befriend fear, we could utilize the juice that's tied up in fear to actually change equality, change gender roles, but also to empower everybody to contribute their genius in the world rather than just following and seeing themselves as victims. But yeah, we've gotten pushback. In fact, we're sort of famous for the pushback that we've gotten, because I think people were so scared of it that they would get sort of outraged, like, well, how can you possibly be saying that? They'd get all blustery. But what we've really seen is that the principles that we first experienced in our relationship that we wrote about, science has proven every single one of them. So, and I didn't have to do the research, which was great. So I can really say that everything that we have pioneered is supported by oodles of research.
Mhm. And do you think some of that fear from people was backed by gender roles?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And like I've been called cocky and snotty and like I just don't know my place, when or people still, people will turn to talk to gay, and not realize that I'm here and I might have something to contribute. But I think at first too, when we started going on television shows, I can't remember which one of them it was. They would say, "Now, which one of you is the talker?" And you would say, "Well, we both speak," but they would very often people would direct their questions to Gay, and this would happen. We were out in any kind of social situation, and so it's been. I think any woman who's in any kind of position of power will say the same thing. Well, you'll notice that the man gets the attention.
Mhm. And then how
So
does that
for a
feel
long time,
having
people would call and say, I'd like to speak to Dr. Hendricks. And I'd say, which one?
Mhm.
So, I let myself have fun with it, but I also would get, I would get offended, because, people would look past me or, we would be at a conference, for example, and people would ask Gay to come and speak. And, I'd be the sort of the aside.
Mhm. That's so frustrating.
Yeah, I think it is beginning to change.
Mhm.
Uh, and it has changed a lot, but I think we've regressed uh, mightily in the last 8 years. I never thought that I would see all of the advances of my youth be erased in my lifetime. And now, the Voting Rights Act, the Equal Rights Amendment, Roe versus Wade. So I'm putting my personal focus is on climate and women's rights. That's
Mm.
what that's what I advocate for in my spare time. That's the petitions and where I'm speaking. And also really advocating for women to occupy their presence fully. And my latest, I don't know if I have a podcast.
Oh, no, I did not know
I have
that.
a new podcast. I'll send it to you, which is really about it's called Be Play Love, and I have with another woman, and we have a half an hour every week, and we're really co-creating, in real time and responding to each other, and we're getting really it's pretty new. We're getting a really good reception about not trying to impose a viewpoint on the other, but to really discover together what wants to happen. I'm also going to send you a link to, I created an app called Presence Connect Play. And my sense is that instead of what we call the drama triangle, Cartman's drama triangle, I worked with that for many, many years in movement. And it was really fun to help people really see how they were occupying the triangle. And I changed it from the hero, from the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim to the hero, the villain, and the victim. And that's how we teach it. And so that, I think, is the only thing that's going on all over the world. Wherever you look at a conflict, you'll see the hero, victim, and villain are going on. Like the United States has been hero all over the world. Like Bill Maher says, in our armed forces, they never leave. We have armed forces all over the place, being the hero. But so I've invented a new way of interacting that I call presence. So I presence myself, so I'm here, and then I connect and genuinely connect. And we know now that connection is the antidote to addiction. Now, not being shamed out of it or medicated out of it, but connected and loved and appreciated. And then play is what wants to happen in this moment in this connection. And so that's what I've been teaching people and 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 participating in, that's really a viable alternative to the triangle, where each of us can contribute our presence and what wants to happen in connection with this person or this group right now, that's going to foster creativity and also playing new games in the world rather than the same old game.
Wow. That sounds so interesting. Um, I don't want to keep you, I don't want to intrude on your time too much. You've been so gracious with it. There is one question that we
Sure.
ask all of the people we interview. So I want to know, in light of all of your experiences, what makes you the most proud of your younger self?
Oh, It makes me cry. Um, gosh, that I stood up for myself, and that I kept asking, what is it that I really want, and how can I create that? I would never have known. I mean, I could have been a professor of English in a small university in the Midwest somewhere. That could have been one pathway. But for me, really standing up for, and also standing up for what I wanted to create and see in the world, and that I kept recommitting. I would say I'm most proud of myself for recommitting, not just saying, oh, this is what I want to do, but going through all of the recommitments that were necessary in order to achieve that.
Wow. That's so great. Well, that's all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing all of these amazing things that you've done with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome, Annie. And I thank you for persisting so that we could actually have this conversation.